By the summer of 2018, Chris Watts' internal world was splitting apart, and the cracks were no longer invisible. On the surface, his life looked unchanged. He went to work every day at Anadarko Petroleum, spoke softly to coworkers, answered texts from friends with polite emojis, and continued playing the role of a devoted father. But psychologically, he had already begun to detach from the life he was living. His wife Shanann and their 2 young daughters had traveled to North Carolina to visit family for several weeks, and in their absence, Watts experienced something that would permanently alter his thinking: relief. For the first time in years, there were no arguments, no expectations, no emotional accountability. The house was quiet, empty, and instead of missing his family, Watts felt unburdened. This emotional response was critical. Psychologists later pointed to this period as the moment Watts began to subconsciously view his family not as people, but as sources of pressure. In his mind, their absence didn't create longing, it created freedom. That freedom quickly became addictive. During this time, Watts deepened his relationship with a coworker, a woman who represented everything his life was not: uncomplicated, affirming, and new. With her, he wasn't a husband struggling to meet expectations or a father overwhelmed by responsibility. He was simply Chris, calm, desired, unjudged. The affair wasn't just physical, it became psychological refuge. And with each day, his brain reinforced a dangerous comparison. Life with his family felt heavy. Life without them felt light. This is where the psychology turns dark. Rather than confronting his marriage, seeking counseling, or accepting the discomfort of honesty, Watts' mind began to engage in cognitive dissonance. He still believed he was a good person, a nonviolent man incapable of cruelty. But his desires no longer aligned with that identity. Instead of changing his behavior to match his values, he began changing his values to justify his desires. Internally, his family transformed from loved ones into obstacles. Text messages from Shanann went unanswered. His tone grew cold, distant, mechanical. When she expressed confusion or concern, he avoided emotional engagement. Conflict avoidance had defined his personality his entire life, and now it reached its most dangerous form. Rather than confronting discomfort, his brain searched for an escape that required no explanation, no confrontation, and no consequences, at least in his distorted thinking. As Shanann prepared to return home, Watts' anxiety intensified. The fantasy he had built, a clean slate, a new identity, was about to collapse. Reality was returning, and with it, responsibility. To a psychologically healthy person, this moment might have triggered confession, separation, or even remorse. But Watts lacked the emotional tools to process shame or accountability. Instead, his thinking narrowed. Investigators later uncovered how Watts began quietly planning, not with rage or chaos, but with eerie calm. He searched for apartment prices, researched romantic getaways, and imagined a future that simply excluded his family. This wasn't impulsive violence. It was psychological erasure. In his mind, removing them solved everything. No divorce, no financial strain, no judgment, no shame. Family annihilator experts describe this mindset as catastrophic avoidance. The offender sees no tolerable path forward that includes facing consequences. Death becomes a solution, not an act of hatred, but of self-preservation. When Shanann returned home in the early hours of August 13th, 2018, Watts was already emotionally detached. Surveillance footage would later show her entering the house. Unaware, she was stepping back into a reality her husband had already abandoned. Inside that home, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Watts had rehearsed conversations in his head, but none involved honesty. What followed would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case: the absence of visible emotion. After the murders, Watts did not flee. He did not panic. He went to work. He answered messages. He gave media interviews, pleading for the safe return of his missing family. To observers, his behavior felt wrong, not because he appeared angry, but because he appeared empty. His facial expressions were flat. His tone was controlled. His language focused on himself rather than his children. This emotional flatness wasn't evidence of calm innocence. It was dissociation. Under extreme psychological stress, Watts' mind fractured. He had committed acts completely incompatible with his self-image, and instead of processing that reality, his brain shut down emotional response. Investigators noted how he spoke about his daughters in the past tense, avoided eye contact, and showed more concern about logistics than loss. The mask was slipping. When detectives confronted him with inconsistencies, his composure wavered. The pressure he had avoided his entire life was finally unavoidable. Each question tightened the psychological noose. His body language changed. His speech faltered. And when faced with incontrovertible evidence, his constructed reality collapsed entirely. But even then, the full truth did not emerge all at once. What Watts revealed, and what he withheld, would expose the final stage of his psychological unraveling. A confession shaped by guilt, self-preservation, and a desperate attempt to control the narrative. And in that confession lay a chilling truth. This crime was never about anger. It was about escape. When Chris Watts finally confessed, the truth did not arrive as a single, honest release. It emerged in fragments, shaped by fear, shame, and a desperate need to preserve whatever remained of his self-image. After hours of interrogation, confronted with mounting evidence and the emotional pressure applied by investigators, Watts offered a version of events that still tried to protect him. He claimed Shannon had killed their daughters, and that he had reacted in a moment of rage. This narrative mattered deeply to him. It allowed him to remain, at least partially, the good man in his own mind, a father who snapped under unbearable trauma rather than someone who initiated violence. But this story quickly unraveled. As investigators continued to press, the contradictions became impossible to maintain. Physical evidence didn't align. Timelines collapsed. And finally, Watts' psychological defenses failed. The dissociation that had kept him emotionally numb gave way to something else: panic. His voice cracked. His breathing changed. The carefully controlled persona could no longer hold. What followed was the true confession, one that stripped away the final illusion. Watts admitted to killing Shannon and their two daughters, not in a moment of uncontrollable rage, but as a calculated act meant to erase the life he no longer wanted. The future he imagined did not include them, and rather than face divorce, financial ruin, or social judgment, he chose annihilation. This distinction is critical. Psychologists emphasize that Watts' crimes were not driven by explosive anger or psychopathy in the traditional sense. Instead, they reflected a profound inability to cope with shame. Throughout his life, Watts avoided conflict at all costs. He suppressed emotions, complied outwardly, and buried resentment until it became internal pressure. When that pressure reached a breaking point, he did not explode outward. He collapsed inward. Family annihilators like Watts often share this pattern. They see themselves as failures long before the violence occurs. But instead of seeking help or accepting responsibility, they externalize the solution. If the family no longer exists, neither does the failure. During sentencing, Watts showed little outward emotion. His statements were brief, apologetic, but emotionally distant. To the families in the courtroom, this absence of visible remorse was devastating. But psychologists later explained that emotional detachment did not mean lack of guilt. It meant an inability to process it. Watts' psyche had relied on emotional suppression for so long that authentic expression was nearly impossible. In prison interviews conducted years later, Watts attempted to reflect on his actions. He spoke about regret, about faith, about understanding the damage he caused. But even then, experts noted something unsettling. His language often centered on how the events affected him. His suffering, his loss of freedom, his internal pain. This isn't uncommon. True remorse requires the capacity to fully empathize with others' suffering, a capacity Watts had long struggled to access. His identity had always been fragile, dependent on external approval and avoidance of judgment. Once that identity shattered, there was nothing solid underneath to rebuild from. The broader impact of the case rippled far beyond one family. For the public, the Watts case shattered comforting assumptions about what danger looks like. There were no prior arrests, no documented abuse, no visible warning signs that scream violence. Friends and neighbors described Watts as quiet, polite, even passive. And that's what made the case so disturbing. It forced an uncomfortable realization. Extreme violence does not always come from rage-filled monsters. Sometimes it comes from people who never learn how to say, "I'm unhappy." Mental health professionals began using the case as a teaching tool, a grim example of what can happen when emotional repression, narcissistic self-preservation, and fear of shame collide. It highlighted the danger of equating calm behavior with emotional health and the risks of glorifying emotional silence, especially in men conditioned to avoid vulnerability. Watts' actions also raised ethical questions about accountability and empathy. How do we understand someone without excusing them? How do we analyze psychology without removing responsibility? Experts were clear on this point. Understanding the psychological mechanisms behind the crime does not diminish its horror. It sharpens it, because it reminds us that the conditions that produced this tragedy are not rare. Avoidance, emotional isolation, identity built on approval, fear of consequences. These traits exist everywhere, in workplaces, relationships, and homes. In most people, they lead to quiet misery. In rare cases, when combined with narcissism and desperation, they lead to catastrophe. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in prison, separated from the world he tried to escape rather than face. There is no redemption arc here, no mystery left unsolved. Only the aftermath of a mind that chose erasure over accountability. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. The greatest danger is not always hatred or rage, but emotional cowardice left unchecked. Because the most dangerous minds don't always look dangerous. They look normal.